Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar organized by the Consumer Goods Forum and the One Planet Network Consumer Information Program. The topic of today's session is the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative from the Consumer Goods Forum and how to build trust in sustainability standards. We have about 1 hour scheduled for this, and before we start with the main session, I'll give a quick introduction, and then we have about maybe 10-15 minutes scheduled for discussion at the end. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to use the question function and type them in, and then also later on you can send more questions, or I can also unmute people at the end for the discussion. But during the presentation, everyone is on mute. But if you have any issues, you can type in the chat to let me know, and I can see if I can help. So today's speakers, my name is Nils Hoyer. I work for UN Environment Program in Paris, and I'm coordinating the One Planet Network Consumer Information Program. I'll explain a little bit more about that shortly. And today's main speaker is Thomas van Haren from the Consumer Goods Forum, and he's the Senior Manager of the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, and will introduce this initiative to us in today's session. So about the One Planet Network and the Consumer Information Program, basically, if you're not familiar with it, the One Planet Network is a multi-stakeholder partnership with organizations from government, private sector, and also civil society organizations for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 12. It was adopted at Rio 2012, and formally it's also known as the 10-year framework of programs. And in this One Planet Network, we have 6 different programs, and one of them is the Consumer Information Program that I help coordinate. We have 3 co-leads, the Ministries of Environment from Indonesia and Germany, and Consumers International, an NGO, and also 20 multi-stakeholder advisory committee members. One of them is the Consumer Goods Forum, so this is how the cooperation came about, and over 100 partner organizations around the globe. Basically, the aim of this program is to support the provision of credible sustainability information on goods and services. For that purpose, for example, we have developed some guidelines on how to communicate sustainability information for businesses mainly, and we also try to develop effective strategies to engage consumers more in sustainable consumption. Another tool or resource that we work quite a lot with is Type 1 Ecolabel, so we have a working group on that as well. And you can find more information about the program on the website or by emailing ciscp@un.org. And basically, for the guidelines or to be able to communicate better about sustainability, businesses also need to align their supply chains and make them more sustainable. So this is why it's an interesting topic today, to look into the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative from the Consumer Goods Forum and hear how this initiative tries to build more trust into standards and makes supply chains more sustainable. And now I'm handing over to Thomas to give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Niels, and thank you everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedule to hear about the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative. Basically, what my goal here is today is to introduce SSCI, as we call it, help you understand why it's an important tool for building trust in sustainability standards worldwide. Talk a little bit on how we foresee companies using SSCI in their supply chains and how they can make the supply chains a little bit more credible using the standards they're already using. And then, of course, answer any questions or comments or hear any feedback that folks have. For those of you who may not know about the Consumer Goods Forum, so we are based, our headquarters are here in Paris, in France. We have some regional offices all around the world, in Tokyo, in China, in Bogota, and the United States. We are a membership organization. We've got about 400 members. From multinationals to SMEs, valued at over 3.5 trillion euros. What makes us, I think, particularly unique is that we are headed up by the global CEOs of these companies. So the CEOs sit on our board of directors, and a lot of the discussions that we have on our sustainability initiatives and various initiatives that we have are done at the CEO level. and then driven down through the work throughout their operations and of course their supply chains. We have because of the companies that we work with, we have a wide range of industry experts on a number of different topics, including plastic waste, food waste, deforestation, forced labor, and supply chains. And obviously, one of the main things that the Consumer Goods Forum works on is bringing these folks together through networking and knowledge sharing opportunities, webinars such as this one, events that we have, and really trying to drive positive change through this collaboration on that level. In terms of our membership base, we are a parity-based organization that splits our members basically between retailers and then manufacturers and brands, so to speak. So in our retailer college, on our board of directors, it's headed up currently by Migros, and then on our manufacturer side is Danone. So again, we have a pretty good range of companies on our board of directors throughout the world, both in Europe, the United States, Japan, and other places, but really focusing on a lot of these issues from the sustainability side. And the idea is that we're working together efficiently for positive change, focusing, as I said, on sustainability, product safety. We have initiatives on health and wellness, and end-to-end value change. And really, what our hope is for is to share information, share best practices. One of the key things for us is, again, making sure that everything that we do is open source in some way. So a lot of the initiatives that I'll be talking about today, in terms of the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, it's all available on our website, our methodology, and some, we are always open to public consultation and feedback on our programs. So here, I'll get to the main topic of today, which is the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, otherwise known as SSCI. And our mission is really to build trust in sustainability standards worldwide. And this is an idea that has been around for quite a while. And it's based on a lot of the programs that we've already run here at the Consumer Goods Forum. So as I said, it's obviously hosted by us here in Paris, and it is the benchmark of choice that is designed for third-party sustainability standards. And it is modeled on the success of the Global Food Safety Initiative, so GFSI. So GFSI is a benchmarking program which focuses on food safety initiatives with various scopes depending on the product, and recognizing those programs that meet the industry expectations for food safety. So we have modeled the SSCI, Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, on the success of that program, which has now entered its 20th year. And really what we've tried to do over the past few years, and with the launch of our program in October, is to set clear guidance on the credible standards. What are the realistic expectations to recognize those programs that meet the expectations of our industry? What we want to do is we want to make sure that the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative, when we create the criteria and as we develop additional scopes, that it's in line with industry expectations. We try to push and advance the conversation of sustainability and sustainable supply chains, but we want to make sure that in all times that we keep the realistic goal of helping workers on the ground who are in the supply chain, as well as making sure that the entire supply chain meets the criteria that we set forth. Again, our goal is to promote good social and environmental practices in global supply chains by benchmarking and recognizing those third-party auditing or certification schemes. And the key to everything that we do at SSCI is really focusing on the benchmarking. And I'll go over a little bit of how we developed the process, some of the criteria that we included in this benchmarking process. But to be clear, the first scope that we set out really focuses on social compliance. So these are social issues like forced labor, child labor, discrimination issues. And really the next scope that we look to, or the next phase that we look to expand into, is the environmental compliance issues. So obviously trying to make the sustainable supply chain both from the social and the environmental side, but this initial phase that we started with focused on the social compliance side. So the SSCI Steering Committee, again, it's a subset of our Consumer Goods Forum members. We have quite a try to achieve parity between the companies in terms of the retailers as well as the manufacturers, and again trying to get various experts on supply chain, on social compliance, on environmental compliance. But this is really the core group that spent the last 2 years developing the criteria, approving the definitions and the different concepts that we have, and really are the driving force between the work here that we've done at SSCI. And of course, it's open to new and new members all the time. And as we grow interest in SSCI, we hope to expand the number of companies that are interested in developing future scopes and criteria. At the end of the day, what the issue is that for sustainability standards is that there's a lot of expectations from different companies. Obviously, retailers have multiple types of products that they have different types of sustainability standards for. They might have commodity-based sustainability standards like for coffee or for cocoa, as well as other sustainability standards for produce or general products, whereas manufacturers, they may be only focusing on one commodity, or they have one product that they're making, and they have a different set of expectations. There are a lot of schemes out there, schemes or sustainability standards. At the last check, I think there's at least over 260 benchmark schemes in the International Trade Center standards map, or sustainability map as it's now called, and there's new programs coming up all the time, whether they're focused on individual commodities, sub-commodities, or general initiatives focused on sustainability. And there's obviously a lot of things that we need to consider, decent working conditions, respecting the environment, and of course aligning with the commitments of the companies to our Consumer Goods Forum resolutions. And again, one of the challenges is that although our model is based on the Global Food Safety Initiative, in food safety, everybody sort of agrees that if you're going to be handling food, you should be wearing gloves, and what temperature that food should be stored at, if it's going to be cold storage or hot storage. In the social compliance space, the word decent working conditions can mean many things depending on what country you're in, the context you're in, or even the industry that you're in. So spending time creating those sustainability standards and those expectations when it's a bit more ambiguous is very complicated in the social compliance space. So, oftentimes in the current model, you have the companies, they engage scheme owners or sustainability standards to work with audit firms or third-party auditors to validate the work of the supplier. So the schemes go on the ground in the producing countries, give a report or a certification or an assessment back to the companies, and then the companies are left to do either the validation or the follow-up work, or work with the schemes to really work on that. And what the goal of SSCI is, as we mentioned, is to really make sure that the scheme owners are credible, that the programs that are coming out and the standards that they're setting meet the industry expectations, and beyond that, that these expectations are met in a way, in a functional way, that the schemes are operating. It's not just enough to say that you're covering issues like child labor and forced labor, but what are you actually doing on the ground to address those issues? So where does SSCI fit in? So, you have, in this world, we have supply chain risk management, we have supplier mapping, we have a lot of things that work on identifying risks at the supplier level and the follow-up action. But the SSCI benchmark really puts itself in this area of the third-party audit schemes. And this is where, when we developed the SSCI, when it came about in its genesis, is really the part where companies struggled the most with understanding what the credibility of those third-party audit schemes were doing. And as I said, there's a bunch of different schemes out there, but SSCI really focuses on benchmarking these third-party audit schemes. It's not going to look at companies' in-house audit programs. We're not necessarily looking right now at capacity building or improvement plans. That may be something that we explore down the line, but really our goal was to set the expectations for these third-party audit schemes. And part of that was, of course, developing the social criteria, and the first social criteria that we focused on was the manufacturing and processing scope. So this is effectively anything that takes place in a factory or where things are made. And the criteria and the topics that we cover within the social criteria are things that you'll see in most sustainability standards. So this is going to be things, as I said, no child labor, freedom of association, health and safety issues, working hours, grievance mechanisms. So these are all topics that social compliance programs and sustainability standards have, for the most part, been already familiar with. But again, we want to make sure that these are the topics that are checked off in our criteria and our benchmarking process. And these are all based on, obviously international references and have alignment with things like the UN Guiding Principles, the ILO, the OECD guidance from multinationals, and really putting it in the framework of, while we have these international reference documents, where can we create the industry expectations based on those, as well as have alignment with the expectations of our industry as well as our stakeholders. So again, the social criteria which we created for processing and manufacturing, I think we have about 72 social criteria. And again, these are focused on the expected elements in a sustainability standard. It's not prescriptive in the sense that we tell a sustainability standard of the way that it must be doing things, but it sets out the framework of the expectations of that a program must have these elements included in their codes of conduct or their audits or their assessment reports. The second part of the SSCI, which is pretty unique, is again this focus on the scheme management. So basically how the sustainability standards actually manage their operations and their governance profiles. So this is focusing, these criteria focus on integrity programs. How, if you have a logo that you put on a product, what are the, do you have a set of rules and standards of who can use the logo and what should happen if there is misuse of a logo? On the other side, what is your relationship with third-party audit firms? Do you have protocols for auditor competence? We just don't want to see somebody given a checklist off the street and asked to do a social compliance audit that gets a sustainability standard checkmark. We want to make sure that you have policies in place. And again, we've, as an industry, has set the minimum expectations, and many of the sustainability standards that we're working with obviously exceed those expectations or have plans in place to make sure that they reach those expectations within a given time. And again, this is a focus that it's not just enough to say that you have an anti-discrimination policy in place, but are you actually interviewing workers? And is it just one worker? Probably not. You need to have a methodology of how you conduct these interviews in the social compliance landscape based on perhaps the size of the factory or the size of the operations that are there. So again, this is something that we want to make sure that the third-party standards that everybody is working with really focus on making sure that those issues are covered in the audit protocol or the assessment or the certification. Again, the scheme management hopes that the schemes are operating in a credible manner. We have alignment with some international standards as well as some standards that have been developed by the industry. So as I said, a lot of our process is based on the model of GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative. Also, we have borrowed some elements from the GSSI, which is the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative, the ICL Assurance Code, as well as ISO 17021. So for our benchmarking process, the program that is undergoing benchmarking must meet both the social and scheme management criteria, and they must meet all of these criteria in order for them to become recognized by the Consumer Goods Forum and the SSCI process. So just to give you a sense of the timeline of the development of this, because as I said, in the social compliance landscape, it does take quite a bit of time to develop these definitions. So in 2017, we had our board meeting, and there was a decision to start SSCI and develop the process for it and figure out the frameworks and the terms of reference for how we were going to create the ultimate benchmark. So, we started at the end of 2017 creating up technical working groups, and the technical working groups focused on the social criteria as well as the scheme management criteria, and decided where we were going to start in terms of manufacturing. We had the first draft of our criteria in early 2018, And we conducted some informal stakeholder exchanges during that time. Again, this was identifying key partners, key potential sustainability schemes or sustainability programs, as well as critical NGOs in the sectors that we would be working in. Again, to sort of engage them to see what was realistic, to see if where the industry was setting the expectations met their judgment in terms of being robust enough, making sure that we covered all the right areas and checked all the boxes in terms of the benchmarking. We then put it out for a more formal 60-day public consultation. We had over 20 stakeholders participated throughout the process. Then we had a stakeholder consultation workshop. So we had one in Geneva and one in New York. We integrated everything in early 2019. Had our second and sort of as close to rough draft as we can, and then we had a legal review, as all the cases with setting these criteria and benchmark. We wanted to make sure that we had legal and sound standing to implement this process, because companies and sustainability schemes would be relying on them to again build trust in the sustainability standards, but without necessarily creating a new sustainability standard on our own. And the SSCI formally launched with our benchmarking criteria in October, late October of this year, and we've begun accepting applications for sustainability standards to become benchmarked. So SSCI offers to do several things. So the idea is that we want to create clear expectations for programs in the marketplace. And this is, again, with the social criteria and the scheme management, most of the schemes that we're working with, or the sustainability standards that the companies use in our portfolio, are already meeting many of these expectations. Or if they're not meeting their expectations, they may just need to explicitly write them out in some cases, or have explicit policies that may have been the practice but were not necessarily well documented. What it also does with SSCI is it allows the Consumer Goods Forum to have an area where we can think a bit about what might need to be in a social assessment or a social audit 2, 3, 4 years from now, and make sure that we have sort of a universal understanding and perhaps a common methodology that we can then share with the sustainability standards. Having come from the world of sustainability standards and helping companies develop them and understand what the expectations would be, it can be a bit complicated when you have different companies approaching you as a sustainability standard, asking you to collect data on certain topics, and then having 18 or 19 different methodologies or expectations. So we wanted to make sure that SSCI set those clear expectations, and then as new topics evolve, we address those in one way by adding them to our criteria. We wanted to apply a robust process for the criteria development, so that's why we have a lot of the public consultation, which is quite critical for the SSCI process. Not only during any of the criteria development do we have the public consultation, but when a program is up for recognition, there will be a period of public consultation that the programs will have to address any potential concerns that those outside stakeholders have. Obviously, we want to support continuous improvement. We want to make sure that everybody has the right framework and the right base to which to build on. And then if sustainability standards want to go above and beyond the criteria that we've set out, that's where they can really focus on issues, such as intense supply chain mapping or worker voice programs, or any number of the different issues that can sort of differentiate a sustainability standard for a company or a commodity or an industry. And I think, in the long run, our hope is to help reduce the time and cost of additional audits and re-benchmarking. One of the main reasons why companies were interested in developing the SSCI is they were often internally having to benchmark programs, especially on the retail side. A factory or a supplier might come to them and say, well, we have a certificate or an audit from XYZ sustainability scheme, will you accept it? And the retailer, they may use another program, and they have to see where, is there equivalence? Is one program collecting all the same information as the other? And our hope is to reduce the time and the burden of these sort of additional checks and additional due diligence, and sort of due diligence that's focused on the basics. You know, I think at the end of the day, personally, I'd rather companies spend more time doing deeper dives into their supply chain, helping them understand some of the deeper issues, as opposed to really, you know, having them to do benchmarking and assessment on whether or not, you know, each program that they have meets some of these minimum expectations on child labor or discrimination. So that's really where SSCI sort of fits into that landscape. In terms of the benchmarking process, so again, this is based on the Global Food Safety Initiative, the GFSI process, and really has been quite a successful program for them. But in essence, everything, as in most cases, start with a self-assessment. So a program that is interested in completing the SSCI benchmark would go have a self-assessment form. They take a look at the criteria. They can see where they stand in terms of aligning with the criteria and providing evidence that they are meeting the criteria where applicable. And then, of course, we have a desktop review where we use, we call them benchmark leaders, but these are effectively independent experts who are familiar with the social compliance landscape, as well as social compliance and sustainability standard schemes. And the benchmark leader does a review and assesses whether, you know, does that program or methodology effectively meet the threshold to meet the criteria for SSCI. After the desktop review, we actually conduct an office visit. So this is where the benchmark leader and somebody from our team here at SSCI actually goes and verifies the benchmark assessments. Again, this is to add an additional layer of checks. We want to make sure that anything that was raised in the desktop review has been addressed properly. We may go in and check additional policies or programs or potential areas of concern that companies have raised to us. But the office visit is, again, an additional layer of support and sort of verification in terms of the benchmark. As I mentioned earlier, there's the public consultation, so it's open for about a period of 4 weeks where we get public feedback, and the companies are asked to respond to anything that any legitimate concerns raised by the public consultation phase. And then ultimately there's the industry validation. So the benchmark leader will submit a report to our SSCI steering committee, and then those companies will vote on whether or not the program is eligible for recognition by SSCI. And when a program is recognized by SSCI, you know, that's sort of the expectation that they've reached all of the criteria, and that program is then recognized on our website, and companies can then use those SSCI recognized schemes in their responsible sourcing policies and programs where appropriate. In terms of the sustainability relevance, you know, this idea of going back to that initial framing of the question that we had, the criteria that we developed fit in that middle place. We want to make sure that scheme owners have that independent review and the validation by our industry, and ultimately that creates the trust in the sustainability standards. Currently, you know, we have a patchwork of companies doing some due diligence on their sustainability standards. For many small and medium enterprises, it can be, it may not be something that they're able to engage with. Maybe they don't have a lot of time or energy, so that, you know, they're happy to accept whatever the scheme owners are presenting to them, and they're happy to accept different audits. But we want to make sure that there's an independent review for these programs, and really make sure that the companies that use the sustainability standards have trust in them, and again can focus on other elements of due diligence or other elements of their responsible sourcing process. Again, we're driving continuous improvement. We're using the GFSI integrity program. So if there are any issues raised for a scheme that's recognized, we have a feedback mechanism for that. We're going to be consistently reviewing and revising our criteria where appropriate, as you know, more and more issues get added to social compliance audits or assessments. We want to be making sure that they're added to our criteria. For one example, if you look back maybe three to 5 years ago, the issues of recruitment fees were not necessarily some issue that were going to be captured by social compliance audits. And because of work done in part by the CGF and our priority industry principles, Those issues are now obviously front and center when it comes to human trafficking and recruitment, forced labor issues. So we want to be consistently thinking of issues that may want to be addressed or collected in terms of data. And again, the process will remain, the benchmarking process will remain fundamentally the same. It's just that the industry expectations will be ratcheted up as we go forward, and new expectations are set forth. And these new expectations may be something that the industry starts expecting from itself. They may be something that stakeholders are asking the industry to address with their suppliers, and it may, in some cases, be government regulations or government expectations. So as the criteria go further or go a little bit higher, you know, that continuous improvement gets driven out through our through the work that we're doing. What SSCI is not, and this is clear, we're not another social compliance standard. We are not setting the requirements. We're not doing any of the auditing. We don't share any of the audits. We don't. We're assessing the audit quality in some cases and how the audits are being conducted, but none of the companies are using us as an audit sharing program. We're not looking at the way companies, if an individual company has an approach, you know, they're welcome to take a look at our criteria, but we're not necessarily recognizing company approaches. We're not setting the responsible sourcing strategy of companies. What we want to do is allow them the freedom to choose how and where SSCI recognized schemes go into their process, but we're not prescribing the way that they should be acting. In terms of the scopes, just to give you a sense of where we're headed with SSCI, so we launched our processing manufacturing scope, as I said, in October of 2019. We're currently under development for our primary production, sort of land-based agriculture, and this will actually also include aquaculture, so any land-based fish or seafood operations. We'll be kicking off the technical working groups for that in early 2020, so next month. And we've also started a collaboration with GSSI, the Global Sustainable Seafood Initiative, to work on seafood-specific scopes, specifically on at-sea operations, so fishing vessel criteria, social criteria for fishing vessels, and those types of operations. And this is again where, if there's anybody on the webinar today that might be interested in joining some of our stakeholder panels, or are interested in keeping track of our developments, you know, certainly you can send us a message or connect with the team here today, and we can certainly get feedback as we develop these additional scopes. And our plan is to launch them in late 2020 or early 2021. And as I mentioned earlier, environmental compliance, we'll be taking a look at where that fits into these programs in another phase of SSCI that may start again this year in 2020. But that's it's going to be some different process. It's going to be obviously not focusing on the social criteria, so we'll have to create a new set of criteria for the environmental benchmarking. You know, just to give you a sense of what we're looking at in terms of primary production or agriculture, you know, as compared to manufacturing and processing, there are a lot of different issues that are different. So how we address smallholders or family farms, you know, obviously a lot of sustainability standards have different definitions and approaches. You know, when we talk about child labor, how do we deal with light work by children and family farms? These are some of the discussions that we have to have in order to set what those definitions are. As you can see, this is why maybe the process in the past took quite a long time, is because different social landscapes, different country landscapes may have different definitions. But we'll be looking at some of these issues as we address the primary production criteria. Our hope is to not fundamentally alter the criteria all that much, but include where appropriate to address some of these issues. You know, land grabbing is obviously a big issue. How do we deal with pesticides, and obviously some sanitary issues, pregnant workers in primary production fields, etc. And really, this is what our challenge is going to be going forward. Is you know, where do we set the industry expectations? How broad do we create the scope? And what will you know, what will be an effective way to make sure that sustainability standards include all of these issues to the satisfaction of our program. A quick reminder of why SSCI is important, sort of the closing few slides here, and really this focus on the immense number of sustainability standards that are out there. This was a tweet from 2012, and this was when the International Trade Center had launched their what was then called the Standards Map, and it was 79 voluntary standards that were ready to go, and they were going to be on their standards map. If you looked in October of 2019, there were 257, and I think even if you look today, it's probably about up to 261. So that's about an average of 27 new standards per year. So for companies, this is it's a very complex landscape. Some of these, obviously cover environmental issues only. Some of them cover social issues only. Some of them have a mix. Some of them are for certain specific commodities. But what should companies accept? What can they trust as being a legitimate program that meets their expectations? Some of them obviously go above and beyond in many areas. Some may not necessarily have the expectations written out, but this is where SSCI is important, is it helps companies navigate this very complex landscape, and by recognizing those schemes that meet the expectations that were set forth by the industry, it helps them understand these new initiatives as they come up, and obviously those programs that have been around for a while, it helps them demonstrate that they have been meeting the industry the industry expectations all along. The other thing why it's important, and this, I know the current climate conference is going on, and the climate issues are taking up a lot of the space, as we saw in the climate strikes in September. But since I joined the program in late September and had our first meeting in October, I wanted to highlight to our steering committee members that social compliance issues still make the news. These are still issues that companies have to worry about. At the time, this is just a 2-week period just before we had one of our big committee meetings in Germany. There were a lot of issues focusing on some forced labor issues in rubber gloves. Many of you may recall the U.S. had denied the importation of rubber gloves made from Malaysia based on some, I think it was some reporting from The Guardian. And then Australia was asked to follow suit. And there's obviously a lot of issues in terms of supply chains that companies are focused on. And what I found particularly unique story was from this Leicester Mercury article on the 13th of October, is that the news was actually following up on companies that said that they were dropping suppliers because of issues. They were actually following up to see why that company was again using a supplier that it had said that it would no longer use. So, it's an issue of that we have to build credible supply chains, and part of that is building sustainability standards and making sure that companies use programs that really meet the expectations and have an independent view on that. It's not just enough to say, yes, I'm using a sustainability standard and they're making sure that my supply chain is great. These sustainability standards need to be credible. They need to make sure that the focus is really on the issues that the industry sets forth, and that not only that those topics are covered, but that they're doing them in the right way. So that's pretty much, on SSCI. Just for next CGF event, we have our global summit in London in next June. So if you're interested in that, you can certainly check out our website. And then just to thank you all for listening, and to give some context for our team. So Didier Bergeret is our Director of Social Sustainability in SSCI, obviously myself, and Surindri Christus-Rina is the coordinator here at SSCI. So again, thank you for taking the time to hear a little bit more about SSCI as we've just kicked off. We're in the process of getting those programs in the benchmarking process, working out the details of the next scopes on agriculture and seafood, and really trying to really drive that idea of trust in the sustainability standards worldwide. So Niels, I'll open it back to you so you can, I guess, hopefully we've got some questions that have come in along the way, and happy to answer them as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very good presentation, Thomas. I think it was very interesting. And then now let's head into the discussion. And I'm sure there's quite a few questions from the audience. I'll just quickly check. And maybe to start off, one question on how do you envision companies will be able to use the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative in the responsible sourcing strategies?
Sure. So I think that companies, there's certainly a number of ways that companies can use SSCI. For some, we kind of see it as a universal tool, so that if there's one program that's recognized or many programs that recognize, they can potentially use that as to say, we will accept a supplier that has any one of these sustainability standards in terms of their audits or assessment reports. Some companies that we've spoken to have suggested that they may continue to use their primary sustainability standard for most of their operations, but for low-risk countries or low-risk commodities or areas where they don't have a lot of spend, they may be open to using SSCI recognized programs for those suppliers. In terms of the manufacturers or those who have maybe not so many schemes that they're working with, it's really making sure that their programs that they're using are robust enough to cover the issues that we've spent 2.5 years developing the criteria for. So SSCI is a very fluid program in that respect. It can allow companies to do as much due diligence as it wants, but really the idea is that it's a tool for them to use as they develop their responsible sourcing program.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this good answer. So a couple more questions are coming in quite a lot, actually. So there's one question about the difference or relation to the ICL Alliance from your initiative.
Sure. So the ICL Alliance, my understanding, so that is an association of the different sustainability standards, and they have set forth sort of a code of conduct that their standards have to go through, and that they have to, again, my understanding is that they have to sort of meet the expectations of their internal code of conduct, and they've also set up things called the credibility principles that standards have to work on. And what we're doing from our side is really the industry, so the consumer goods industry and our members' expectations. So from the company side, we're saying, these are the expectations and the threshold that you need to meet in order for a program to be SSCI recognized. Whereas ICL, I know that they do a lot of good work on best practices in developing certain methodologies for sustainability standards, but we're really focused on making sure that the standards meet these expectations of the industry and recognizing them through an independent process. And we've incorporated, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, some of the ICL principles into our scheme management program, as well as I was recently on a panel hosted by them about credibility and their credibility principles. So there's a lot of synergies in some ways, but the approaches are a bit different.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I think we also have two questions about the stakeholder involvement. If there are, for example, other organizations involved apart from industry, and also why there were no governments in the steering committee, or do you consider that governments have an important role to play in making supply chains more sustainable? How do you see that?
Sure. So in terms of this, at the steering committee level or the technical working group level that created a lot of the criteria, obviously this is a tool that is designed for our members. It is open source, so obviously anybody can use it, but at its core, it's designed for our members and setting up the expectations for programs from our side. Now, in terms of the stakeholder engagement in terms of either NGOs or governments, that was where sort of the informal stakeholder consultations that took place following the draft criteria, as well as the more public forums, either the sort of open public consultation on our website or the public forums that we held in New York and Geneva. And that's where, those stakeholders can get involved as well. And as I said, if there are groups that are interested, I'm happy to have more and more stakeholders be a part of that. But the initial criteria and the ultimate decisions are decided by our steering committee and our technical working groups. In terms of the question about the governments, I think they do play a role in helping setting forth what the expectations are for sustainable supply chains. And I think we're certainly welcoming them in part of our consultations. We're working with different groups to get their feedback, and sharing this information with, the U.S. government as well as the European Union, and making sure that their expectations, if they develop programs or if they start either regulating or developing guidelines for sustainability standards, this is where that they know that this is where the industry has sort of set their bar, and where can we find to drive a lot of the improvements on the ground.
Okay. Yeah, there was also one more question in terms of how it compares to other programs. So how does it differ from the Global Social Compliance Program that's also been developed previously from the Consumer Goods Forum?
Sure. So GSCP was a Consumer Goods Forum project. It predates me, so I'm not too familiar with the development there. But I think what the GSCP focused on sort of giving grades to sustainability programs as well as company programs, and really focused in some ways on developing a best practice model. And what I think the lessons in terms of what was learned for SSCI was best practice is very hard to implement across different programs, different industries, even different countries. And it's difficult to say, okay, because you're doing very good work in, say, worker voice or specific areas, that you get a higher grade than another company that's just sort of doing, average. Or a scheme that's doing average issues, but again, meeting all of the expectations, just not doing as much. And I think with GSCP, it was quite a complicated process. There was a lot of things that went back and forth in terms of making sure that companies and schemes met the best practice criteria. Whereas SSCI, it's a threshold. Basically, if you're meeting the threshold, you get recognized by the program. If you meet all the criteria, you're recognized. And then if you go above and beyond and do best practices and do amazing things on certain topics, then that's where you can differentiate yourself to the companies that you're working with. So that's sort of the main fundamental difference, I think, between SSCI and the predecessor program GSCP.
Okay, thank you. There has also been 2 questions about the results of your benchmarking processes. Are these going to be available to everyone, or how are they shared? And yeah, that's the main question.
Sure. So once programs start undergoing the benchmarking process, so the benchmark report that we will put out for public consultation, so that will be available on our website, and that's something that's publicly available. And then ultimately, after the company gets a chance to respond to that, and if they are recognized, then they will be recognized on our website with the benchmarking report. Sort of the final write-up of the assessment on our website as being recognized as meeting the SSCI criteria. So again, it's all will be transparent in that sense, that those recognized schemes that are on there, also those programs that are currently undergoing the process, they have the option of also being recognized as being on in progress track to ultimately reach SSCI recognition.
Okay, and at this moment, are there already certifications or standards participating to be benchmarked, or and also will they get like some kind of recognition if they are being successfully benchmarked by SSCI?
Yeah, so currently we have programs that are in the exploratory phase. So they've got the application documents and they've got our self-assessment, and once they're ready to undergo the formal process, we'll start the desktop review and start scheduling office visits. So currently, right now, there aren't any SSCI recognized schemes or programs, but as and when they complete the benchmark process, we will have a landing page on our website and have announcements that the first schemes have successfully completed the benchmark.
Okay. Let me just check what else we have. Yeah, so basically also questions about the credibility of your benchmarking process. So basically, would you say that the standards themselves aren't necessarily credible if they are not benchmarked by you, or is it just to ease the identification from the industry side, or
I think, in essence, SSCI is a tool for the industry to understand what is a credible sustainability standard. It doesn't necessarily imply that if you're not benchmarked or if you're not yet recognized that you're not a credible standard, but it's just that that you have not necessarily met the expectations of what the industry is setting forth. It is, at the end of the day, I think, a tool for the companies to sort through a lot of different sustainability standards are out there, and we expect many of them to work with programs that may not necessarily ultimately reach SSCI recognized level. But our hope is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these programs do already probably meet 80 to 90% of the criteria that we have set forth. It just may be that they need to be more explicit in the way that it's written out, or maybe it's not, there's a standard practice that they've always used, but the methodology is not quite written out or publicly available, or they need to change a few mechanics that their process uses. So the idea is, again, we're building trust and trying to increase credibility. So those programs that ultimately do go through the SSCI benchmarking and get recognized can be seen as more credible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that programs that don't go through the process are not credible. It just means that for whatever reason they've chosen not to obtain or have not yet reached the industry expectations for the different scopes that we have.
Okay. And then also a question if standard-like audit programs managed by consultancies or other bodies like SEDEX, ETI, and Elevate are covered in your initiative as well, and if CGF members are encouraged to adopt the criteria in their in-house audit programs as well.
Sure. So currently, the programs that are open for the benchmark are sustainability standards that are not owned or operated by audit firms. They have to be sort of an independent from the audit firm model. That's just what we're looking at in terms of our current program. So something like SEDEX is certainly eligible to benchmark, but Elevate or those programs run by some of the other third-party programs, third-party auditors would not be eligible for recognition at this point. Obviously, our criteria are available online. They can do an internal self-assessment and demonstrate to their stakeholders, if they want, that they would meet all of those the criteria check marks, but it just would not be independently validated by us. In terms of companies, it's the same story. We're not at the point yet, and we don't necessarily foresee an independent assessment of company programs, but as same point as I just said, if they want to take a look at the criteria and see where their programs are meeting them, or if they're using third-party audit schemes on their own, and ask them to undergo sort of a self-assessment or an internal assessment to see where they meet the criteria, that's always an option as well. The big thing that I mentioned at the beginning with CGF is that a lot of our materials are open source. We want companies to use them. We want sustainability programs to use them, governments, whoever might get some benefit from having this work done, is certainly available to them.
Okay, and also maybe a more practical question in terms of companies using this SSCI tool, benchmarking tool. Do you think that, would you recommend that companies are hiring independent consultants to help with the process, or do you think they can do that on their own?
So this is the, I guess this is towards the sustainability standards, because obviously the companies, the brands and retailers, those types of companies, they can rely on the work that we're doing here to do the benchmarking. But if there's a sustainability standard, I think they won't need an independent expert to do the self-assessment. I think again, we have a file that we can help them with that. They should be familiar enough with their own program, where again the criteria are pretty straightforward, and we try to get the language as accessible as possible without being as prescriptive as possible. So it's always a good time, either if you're going to be reviewing your criteria or amending your criteria of your sustainability standard, to take a look at where SSCI's criteria fit. But I think the independent expert certainly comes from the benchmarking process. That's something that we handle internally here. So the benchmark leader is something that is a consultant that we've approved and vetted for the benchmarking process. I don't necessarily foresee a sustainability standard needing a consultant to guide them through the SSCI process. That's something that we're here to support with as well.
Okay, and so these independent reviewers, they would often also be from consultancies, or where are they usually?
So they generally have a background in social compliance. They may have been auditors in the past for audit firms, but right now they are independent outside of consultancies. So they can't currently be working for a third-party audit schemes. If they have worked for a sustainability standard in the past, they may not necessarily be eligible to benchmark that sustainability standard. But we endeavor wherever possible to get the best experts that are not currently affiliated with any consultancies.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're almost out of time, but maybe just quickly 2 more questions. So one is about the self-assessment, if this can be found online as well, or is that requested from you? Or
just because of the nature of the file, it's something that can be requested from us or through our website. It's the only thing that we're keeping track of internally right now, but the criteria are available online. It's just a self-assessment. You can certainly reach out to us through our website or through our email to get a copy of that.
Okay, and then maybe to end with one final question on the consumer side. So basically, do you see consumers involved in any way in this process, or how are they benefiting from this initiative? What is your view on that?
Yeah, I think when the process started out, consumers obviously were the consumer goods forum, and consumers are using the direct beneficiary of a lot of the products that our companies are making, but it's not necessarily something that consumers would benefit from directly in terms of understanding what SSCI recognition might mean. I don't necessarily see a consumer saying to a company, I'll only buy your product if you're using an SSCI recognized program for your social compliance auditors, or for your social or sustainability standards. But I think I think in terms of the consumer input, we have the public consultation and those areas there, but it's not necessarily something that's designed for the average consumer, or to understand that it helps build some of the credibility with the social assessments that are done by some of the labels that you might find on a consumer product. But at the end of the day, the consumer, it's not something that's necessarily within their what they're worrying about at the end of the day on that.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we end the session here. I mean, I'll also share the rest of the questions if there were any that we haven't answered now with you, and you can maybe follow up with the attendees afterwards or so. And we will also save the recording and put it on our YouTube channel from the One Planet Network.
Yeah, that sounds great. Any other questions? Yeah, I'm certainly happy to answer them now or later on. If you've come up with something, you'd certainly send us a message.
Yeah, I mean, if you, I think I thought you had to go, but if you want, you can have a couple more minutes.
I think I can take one more question, and then yeah, I've got to run out.
So I think one more question was again about the stakeholder involvement process, because this is mainly done through the website and informal processes, so to say, like you upload it and then people can get involved, might not actually know about it or so. Do you think that could be improved, or how do you view it?
Yeah, so we have the sort of the public consultation process on our website. Obviously, if there are stakeholders that are listening today and that want to get involved or stay abreast of that, we can certainly add you to our mailing list. Or if there are stakeholders that we are advised by our companies to involve in the process, then we have more one-on-one conversations with them, set up some calls, some conversations with them separately beyond the sort of general public feedback sessions. But I think that's it all depends on where those stakeholders want to get involved. If it's something that's more intense, we're certainly happy to have those conversations with them where appropriate. If they want to just do an informal feedback through the website, then that works as well. But certainly, if there are stakeholders interested in more engagement, we can arrange that as well.
Okay, I think there's one more that was hopefully can quickly be answered.
Sure.
So about the resources, I assume, are all in English, or are you planning to have any translations? So I think there was a question from a Chinese participant, or also if resources would be available in Spanish was a question that's been asked.
Sure. Currently, yeah, everything is in English. Our hope is to eventually expand out to where our member base is. So obviously we have members in China and Japan and in Latin America as well. So it's a process, but of course it's something that we have to undertake and as we go forward.
Okay. Yeah, it's great. We will definitely also follow up and see how this develops further with the additional criteria or like sectors that you're trying to address. And personally, I'm quite looking forward to the environment criteria as well, but I understand this will maybe take a bit more time.
Yeah, it's a bit more complicated, so we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for attending the webinar, and have a good day, and hope to see you on another webinar of ours soon again.
All right, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks
Enjoy
again, Thomas. Goodbye.